climate change and its consequences. Today, according to different studies, more than 70% of natural disasters are linked to climate change. Maybe it's a point that some of you are going to challenge, but according to our studies, it's the case. So it's twice as many as 20 years ago, and the figure will probably increase in the future. So climate change and its consequences is really a very, very serious issue. And as you certainly know, France will host the 21st session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COP21, or otherwise known as Paris 2015. This conference will take place in Paris from November 30 to December 11th, and this conference will bring together around 40,000 participants in total. It's the largest diplomatic event ever hosted by France to tackle this issue of climate change and consequences. This conference is very ambitious and with different objectives, but the most ambitious objective is to achieve an international binding agreement that applies to all countries to limit global warming to below 2 degrees. So the topic you are going to discuss is really a key issue, and we really look forward to listening from you. So maybe just a word to introduce ourselves. So I'm Sébastien from the Consulate, from the Deputy Council.
Hello, I'm Gilles Delcourt, I'm the Deputy Culture Attaché.
I'm Philippe Perez, I'm the Science and Technology Attaché.
So Stéphane is our Cultural Attaché. Anne is in charge of press and communication, so we're going to communicate with them. So if you want to introduce yourself.
I'm Christina Saby, and I'm in the Communication Studies Department at San Francisco State.
And I'm Kieran Ringenberg, a former debater and current practicing lawyer.
Hi, I'm Becky Ipsata. I'm a Communication Studies professor at Diablo Valley College.
I'm Jonah Feldman. I'm the director of the debate program at UC Berkeley.
I'm Ben Crossan. I'm the assistant director of the debate program at UC Berkeley.
I'm Rich Baltazar, director of debate at Stanford University.
Thank you very much. And so the floor is open. I'll let you proceed with the debate.
We, as the affirmation stand resolved that all states have an obligation to anticipate, prevent, and minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. Intention 1 is a framework. States have an obligation to their own citizens. So climate change is real and anthropogenic, and its future effects will have catastrophic implications for the entire world. According to the 2014 climate report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, human influence on the climate change system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. Recent climate changes have had widespread impacts on human and natural systems. This report also lists projections that have ranked its potential effects by confidence. Here are some of the most insidious effects that have received a high confidence rating by the IPCC. A large fraction, quote, a large fraction of species face increased extinction risk due to climate change. Most plant species cannot naturally shift their geographical ranges sufficiently fast to keep up with current and high projected rates of climate change. Coastal systems and low-lying areas are at risk from sea level rise, which will continue for centuries even if the global mean temperature is stabilized. Climate change is projected to undermine food security. For wheat, rice, and maize in tropical and temperate regions, climate change without adaptation is projected to negatively impact production for local temperatures increases of 2 degrees Celsius or more above 20th century levels. Climate change is projected to reduce renewable surface water and groundwater resources in most dry subtropical regions. Until mid-century, projected climate change will impact human health mainly by exacerbating health problems that already exist. Throughout the 21st century, climate change is expected to lead to increases in ill health, especially in developing countries with low income. In urban areas, climate change is projected to increase risk for people, including risks from heat stress, storms, and extreme precipitation, inland and coastal flooding, landslides, air pollution, drought, water scarcity, sea level rise, and storm surges. Aggregate economic losses accelerate with increasing temperature. Climate change impacts are projected to slow down economic growth and make poverty reduction more difficult. So given these scenarios, every state has an obligation to address the issues of climate change. That we recognize that not every state can tackle the problems of warming with the same intensity, but Therefore, we support a common but differentiated principle. With so much at risk, climate change policy must come from a strict adherence to principles, and rather than worry about issues of convenience. There is little to risk by taking precautionary measures, and the irreversible nature of climate change demands that we must err on the side of prevention. Cass Sunstein from the University of Chicago writes in 2007 that, quote, because greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for centuries, the problem of climate change may be irreversible. In this light, we may identify an irreversible harm precautionary principle. In the case of climate change, people believe we should refuse to commit resources problem until evidence is unmistakably clear. But even assuming that evidence is not so clear, research without action allows greenhouse gas emissions to continue, which might provide risks that are irreversible. The best course of action might be to take precautions now as a way of preserving flexibility for future generations. Unquote. Therefore, we must take charge soon. To achieve the global goal of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius, we must act quickly. According to Glenn Peters et al. From the Center for International Climate and Environmental Research, ongoing climate negotiations have recognized a significant gap between the current trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions and the likely chance of holding the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Further delay in global mitigation makes it increasingly difficult to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. Although current emissions are tracking the higher scenarios, it is still possible to transition towards pathways consistent with keeping temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. The historical record shows that some countries have reduced CO2 emissions over 10-year periods through a combination of non-climate policy intervention and economic adjustments to changing resource ability. The oil crisis of 1973 produced a decrease in the share of fossil fuel as oil shifted to nuclear in Belgium, France, and Sweden, with emission reductions of 4 to 5% per year sustained over 10 or more years. A continuous shift in natural gas led to sustained mitigation rates of 1% to 2% per year in the UK in the 1970s, again in 2000s, 2% per year in Denmark in the 1990s to 2000s, and 1.4% per year since the 2005 in the US. Similar energy transitions could be encouraged and coordinated across countries in the next 10 years using available technologies. Unless large and concerted global mitigation efforts are initiated soon, the goal of remaining below 2 degrees Celsius will very soon become unachievable. Our contention 3 is that climate change requires an obligation from all countries. All states must fulfill the obligation of mitigating the adverse effects of climate change because their citizens' lives are in danger. Preventing, minimizing, and anticipating the effects of climate change, states should also keep an eye on their future emissions and do their part to stop climate change. Why doesn't combating climate change entail an obligation for all countries? As developing countries continue to develop as frontier and emerging markets transition into more developed stages, they'll become some of the largest emitters of fossil fuel. Some examples include India, China, Russia, and Brazil. So, the EIA's International Energy Outlook from 2013 projects that this growth in world energy use largely comes from countries outside of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Energy use inside the OECD are relatively stable. It's projected to grow by 0.5% per year in non-OECD countries. Faster growing economies and changing habits and highly concentrated populations drive significant increases in energy use. This certainly does not mean developed countries have less of an obligation. Rather, this simply means that developing countries have an obligation to combat climate change as development and growth continue. For these reasons, you should vote for the government.
Who should determine whether a state is anticipating and preventing enough climate change?
Well, here's the thing, that we believe that in each state that there are certain restrictions that we take into account. There's no universal one actor that determines whether or not they're meeting their obligation.
So would it be like the UN would come together, there'd be a binding treaty, or how would it occur that we determine what's best for each state?
Well, yeah, I think this is a good discussion that's meant to be done internally. The reason why we can't make policy prescriptions for over 190 countries because each country has different needs, right? So we don't necessarily advocate for a necessarily particular form of combating climate change in each country, and we believe that those specific policy input discussion should be left to their individual
But what about things like emissions targets? Who determines what the emissions target should be for, say, China?
Well, again, yes, we agree that, for example, in the case of China, emissions targets, that of course we would go with recommendations for experts. But again, the emission targets, it's the target itself can be set by experts. But the other question is how are they going to achieve the emission targets, right? China, and we believe that there are a lot of technological approaches that they can use, but we're not here to necessarily debate the specifics about which is more effective, because we believe that, like, as I say, they would, like, intuitively choose the most effective one as a rational act, right?
Okay, thank you. I want to talk about the precautionary principle
Okay.
briefly. What if the precautions that you take lead to net more suffering? Should we still obey the precautionary principle
Right,
in
so
terms of climate?
here's that's the thing, like, precautionary principle says that, yes, if it leads to net more suffering, then we shouldn't take those actions.
Then we shouldn't take those
Right,
actions.
but that
Okay.
requires the burden of proof of proving harm to those precautions, right?
Sure.
So it's like, that's pretty consistent with the precautionary principle.
So you make the argument that many emissions come from non-OECD countries, but isn't it true that those emissions are a result of supplying consumer goods towards OECD countries?
Well, it depends. That's why we believe it's a universal obligation, right? Like, so right now, currently, like, yes, there's a lot of loopholes in, like, going to other countries to make emissions where they're, like, not strict, where the standards are not as strict, right? But that's why it's something that's universal, right? Like, that way we can prevent, like, say, companies or corporations from going to other countries, right, making factories to increase emissions, right? So this is, like, so that they can't go to those countries, produce goods to get around the emissions loophole.
Okay, thank you. What does strict adherence mean? You say repeatedly that strict adherence to these policies is incredibly important.
Well, that's what we're saying as, like, just strict adherence to these principles. Like, these principles, like, the resolution we're treating as a principle, right? Like, not necessarily a specific policy implementation, which is, that's what we mean, just like.
So, how do you ensure that strict adherence happens? Governments of developing countries are historically very adverse to trying to limit their emissions.
Right, like, you're right, like, the reality of the situation is that it's really hard to get international discourse on this one subject and get international agreement. But I think this is one principle that we should all agree on. That's what we're at.
Thank you. I think we have 2 minutes of preparation, Michael.
Oh, it's an excellent surprise.
Does it have Matt Damon's voice on it? It'd be great if the trailer started. It's like, I'm totally beat. So we can never do non-audiobooks. Never, but it would be nice. No, I understand, but like, would it be easy? Could we do non-audiobooks after like a year? Would it be easier to do it after that, or?
Sure, I'll be able to here.
No, ones that don't. Also.
You think you could maybe move to where I'm sitting?
Yes.
I'm just gonna scoot from over here so I can address the panel. Cool, thank you.
No, I'm done with it. I totally understand.
It is irresponsible for discussions of climate change to proceed without a robust consideration of social justice and of equity. Developed countries are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gases. They should not pass on the burden of responding to this challenge to those countries that are struggling to feed their people and to grow their economies. We argue that to say developing countries have an obligation to anticipate and prevent the adverse effects of global warming distracts necessary resources from their economic development, as well as being a deeply flawed view of responsibility that continues the dominance of the developed world over developing countries. Indeed, developing countries have vastly different needs and interests in terms of climate adaptation. They cannot afford to, quote, anticipate and prevent in the same way as developed countries, because their economic needs require them spending resources to reduce reliance on agriculture, which might, in the short term, increase emissions. Indeed, research from Thomas C. Schelling, a distinguished university professor of economics and public affairs at the University of Maryland, confirms our argument when he noted that climate is often a secondary environmental concern, and developing countries are often grappling with more immediate ones, such as air pollution, poor sanitation, and disease, all of which have a greater impact on their populations. Forcing these countries to address climate change first is a recipe for massive suffering and subverting the development of nations across the world. You need to do a triage before you can perform open heart surgery, or else the patient will die on the operating table. In the same way, if people in developing countries are dying from dysentery, there is no way to credibly or ethically impact climate change. Now, while Stanford recognizes the need for a, quote, differentiated approach, they are enacting this differentiated approach through a requirement of strict adherence to universal standards that is hoisted upon developing countries. This necessitates a direct trade-off, because developing countries cannot both address climate change while investing in infrastructure that's necessary to facilitate economic development. These countries should be given the opportunity to strengthen their economic base, because this is the only way that there can be a sustainable solution to climate change in the long run. After developing countries have achieved a certain level of security and prosperity, they can begin to take action to mitigate emissions. Citing an article in Bloomberg written in 2014, the quote is that developing countries need more economic growth and more energy today, and nothing should stand in the way of that progress. Although it would be nice to believe that there is no trade-off between sustainability and development, such a trade-off undeniably exists. This article from Bloomberg goes on to say that forcing climate change mitigation could even trade off with development goals, such as reducing poverty that plagues billions of people across the world today. Moreover, historical context places the responsibility for addressing climate change squarely upon the shoulders of developed countries, instead of the universal obligation the affirmative talks about. Industrialization began the pollution trends that currently threaten the globe. No other solution would be reasonable or equitable. According to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, speaking in 2012, quote, "Rich countries are to blame for climate change and should take the lead." UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, quote, "Only fair and reasonable that the developed world should bear most of the responsibility in fighting the gradual warming of the planet." Now, even without positioning the affirmative's requirement for countries to take climate preventive action, developing countries are already taking action now that will address the most major climate concerns. They see their inherent checks on emissions that will suffice in the absence of, quote, strict adherence or a positive requirement, because it is within countries' interest to reduce pollution and suffering of their populace, but they must be allowed to do so at a gradual rate. This is the global issues in 2012. Brazil, China, India, and Mexico, and other such fast-growing developing countries have slowed their rising greenhouse emissions by more than the total cuts demanded of rich nations by the Kyoto Protocol. Yet this is rarely reported by the mainstream. Policies primarily intended to curb the air pollution from factories and cars to save energy have had the side effect of fighting global warming. Note, however, that emissions are still rising, but at a much slower rate. China has a goal of getting 15% of its energy from renewable sources by 2020. Compare that to, say, the industrialized country that feels it is taking a lead in climate change affairs, the United Kingdom, whose goal is 10% of all its electricity to be from renewable sources. Modeling developing country climate change commitments after industrialized country commitments is not the way to go. Thus, this proves that there is an opportunity for tangible improvements in resolving climate change, while at the same time not forsaking economic development, which, as of the 1AC Cross-X, they agree is a valuable goal that must be weighed side by side with the goal of preventing climate change. Moreover, it's necessary to address emissions on a per capita basis to achieve the necessary reductions. Otherwise, wealthy countries are able to sit back and merely address their production emissions, while developing countries are unable to keep up. For instance, the US could claim that Bangladesh must reduce its emissions by a huge amount, while at the same time maintaining its consumption patterns that are underlying causes of environmental effects and why there are the emissions from Bangladesh in the first place. This way, nothing gets done in terms of addressing warming, and at the same time, it maintains a dangerous precedent. Thus, for all of these reasons, it is necessary to consider the poverty across the world and reject the affirmative's notion of a universal solution and strict adherence only exacerbate that problem while doing nothing to resolve climate change. Absolutely.
Is it your presumption that like all efforts to mitigate or anticipate climate change require the use of resources on the part of the government?
It's not our presumption. It's rather something the 1AC said in the context of, quote, strict adherence to universal standards. Our Bloomberg evidence, as well as the quotation from UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon, all indicate the majority of climate adaptation and elimination schemes all require the government to spend resources or initiate tax credits to facilitate renewable energy or simply to construct adaptation measures. What that does is it hollows out already weak state budgets across the world and forces a trade-off in the zero-sum game of budgetary politics between something like
for example,
reducing air pollution or global warming.
Sorry, but
yeah, absolutely.
In the case of you're saying your advocacy of a per capita basis, correct? Like, so is it just that people who are below the per capita basis have no obligation? Is that where you're...
What we mean, and what the literature believes when it says per capita basis, is referring to a focus on consumption instead of production. So if a factory in India or Bangladesh or China is producing goods for consumption in a Western country, it's that Western developed country that should bear responsibility for those emissions instead of the country that's merely meeting that demand.
Wait, so...
That's
but
what,
like, from a government perspective, what does that say about the state? Like, so
I'm not sure what you mean by
so like countries that have below the per capita emission, do they have any obligations?
We don't think that developing countries should have a positive obligation to take measures to stop climate change hoisted upon them.
And so, what kind of restrictions would you say, like, because part of your advocacy talks about the historical nature of climate change, right?
Absolutely.
So, given that, say, the U.S. has polluted a lot in the past, but China is currently rising, China doesn't have that long history, so does that mean it should have a responsibility?
Or, first of all, we've read evidence that cites failures from China's pollution standards that indicate they're on track to reducing their emissions by 15%.
Right.
Something that the U.S., especially with the fracking boom, can hardly say of itself.
So, right, so we can talk about how China's doing right now, but like, ethically speaking, just like, in the realm of moral obligations, they would also have one, correct? Like, so what's the standard for that?
The standards that countries who are responsible for the majority of climate change should have to take action to address that.
And so how's
We've
that?
read evidence that it's Western industrialized nations who bear that
So there are
responsibility.
two standards. One is like from a historical responsibility, one is per capita. How do you reconcile those two standards?
Why do you believe that there's a contradiction between the two?
Well, I'm just curious, as in like...
They function side by side. One is evidence of historical responsibility, and the other is evidence of present responsibility, both of which bolster our argument.
So